very good to be back. I don't miss much about Sacramento, I have to say. If there's one thing I do miss, it's this church, honestly. We have a nice community, we have some friends, but this church really was the only thing keeping us in the Sacramento area. And I'm happy to be back to share more news with you about American politics. I've been seeing more and more online, top kind of prominent Republicans and top Democrats, they agree on something. And they all agree that this next election will be our last one. So you have to find, the silver linings and things. So today I want to talk to us about why is it that maybe objectively the stakes are higher in our elections, but maybe even more importantly, subjectively, that it feels like the stakes are higher in our elections. And we're going to take a kind of political science perspective. And what that means is we're not going to blame individual politicians because that never really explains very much of anything. Politicians are responding to various incentive structures and systems and rules and procedures. So we need to take a long, historical, broad view to understand different changes and developments in American life. And Americans are overwhelmingly more and more concerned with the election and what the outcomes and stakes are in the election. So I'll just show you a few polls. Here, the gray box, I'm just going to have to point. The gray box are those Americans who feel as if democracy could be at stake in the next election. And so we have an overwhelming majority of Americans who believe that the next election, really, it's not just policies I don't like, but the very system of government is at stake. And therefore, my side must win. The green are those who say it's too late. It doesn't matter. It's already broken forever. And you can see the disaffection among independents that say, what's the point? It's already too late, that kind of attitude. This is from the National Election Studies. This is the primary data set that political scientists use. It's asked the same questions since the 40s, so it's very useful at seeing how things have changed over time. And here you can see that among those who say, I care a great deal about who wins the presidential election, more and more Americans over time increasingly have said, this actually really matters, in comparison to, say, the 70s, when it was like, Carter, who cares? But now, a great deal of Americans care a great deal about the outcomes of the election. So this isn't a brand new thing, but it is a kind of new thing. If we're looking at like 50-year chunks of American history, we can say that this is an increasing trend. They changed the question from a kind of 2 options to 5 options. And once you do that, you kind of disaggregate those answers, and you can see that in 2020, it was like 2% of people didn't care at all about the election, and the overwhelming majority of Americans said, this is a really serious thing. So if you feel like this is the most important election, you're not alone. Everyone feels that way. And so it's worth exploring, why is this happening? And I'm particularly interested in this question because our original design had the goal of lowering the stakes of each individual election. So if you read Madison's defense of the Constitution, which is a kind of post hoc defense, because he voted against nearly every kind of constitutional development at the convention, but then after the fact came up with the best defenses of it. So if we look at Madison's defenses of it, he says this is great because we get a strong national government, so we're able to solve problems, and low stakes elections. We're not really having the low stakes elections anymore. So we need to ask why? What has happened in American life? So first, let's try to figure out what the original design was, or what was the original plan that would produce low stakes elections, because we, broadly speaking, on average, had pretty low stakes elections until the 90s. And so things worked out as originally planned. So this is, of course, Federalist 10. I take it to be the most important document in all of American life if you want to understand the American project. And he says this: the smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. So here he's thinking about, okay, let's think about all the republics in history. They all failed. Most of them failed because of internal faction. It's not they were conquered, it's that they were conquered from the inside out. So the chief problem we have to solve with the Constitution is solving the problem of faction. He's also thinking here about the dominant 18th century political science, which said, I did something. Oh, this is more exciting than me.
Wait, what?
I'm going to take this with me.
Man, I can't follow Magnum PI.
Lost connection there.
Well, he gets that back.
There we go.
The kind of textbook of political science at the time would have been Montesquieu, The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748. And there he argues that if you want to have a republic, it has to be small. If you want to have a large nation, you have to have a king, because how else are you going to unite people that are far away from each other? Now, Madison is thinking this through, and he's thinking, actually, the opposite is true. Now, he doesn't come up with this. This is a crowd that likes the Scots. So I'll say, this is the Scottish Enlightenment he's taking this from. Okay? So it's a Scottish idea. But the idea is, no, the opposite's true. The best way to have a republic is not to have a small republic where we all know each other. Why? Because you'll have family squabbles that'll end in death. The best way to have a republic is to have a massive, radically diverse nation. So here's his argument. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party. And you don't want a majority that's easily found. The smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, and the smaller the compass, the size within which they are placed, the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. What we want to do is prevent natural majorities from forming, and if they do form, we want to prevent them from taking power in government. Everyone with me? So what do? Extend the sphere. Have a huge nation, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens, or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. Meaning, if a majority forms and takes power in government, that's the ball game. In fact, later in his life, he wrote about the Bill of Rights won't protect us. The Supreme Court won't protect us. Constitutional conventions won't protect us. If a majority forms around something and takes power in government, they always, 100% of the time, will get what they want. So what do? You frustrate that majority, and you make sure you get 1,000 different factions instead of just 2. And so our government artificially divides up America to maximize the amount of views being heard in Washington. So we have this incredibly complicated, it's one of the most complicated schemes of government ever devised. That's why it takes me so long to explain it to freshmen. We have, all of these are your representatives. You don't have one representative, you have a long ballot where you vote on all these different representatives. And we're dividing up the nation, not only in terms of space, so different districts and states and different geographic lines and counties and cities and all that, but also in terms of time. So they're all on different electoral calendars. And even the Senate's on a different electoral calendar. So the California Senate and the US Senate, it's a portion of the Senate every 2 years. So if a kind of passion flows through the nation, it can't take over all of the government, lowering the stakes of the election. So we're trying to maximize how many factions are being represented in Washington. You don't want 2, you want 1,000. So the total number, for example, total number of non-federal office holders is about 500,000. So we have 500,000 people being elected for office. We have 537 people being elected for national office. We're divvying up the nation to maximize how many factions are created, with the goal that all the factions are very small, and therefore, in any one election, sure, you can vote for all different kinds of candidates, but at no point will one faction take over, because they all have to compromise and work together to get anything done. So, majorities should be institutionally created through procedures, created through committee structures, okay? They should be hard to form. And this creates what we call cross-cutting cleavages. What you don't want is one divide in which all the different social and religious groups kind of fall on one side or the other. Because the more they fall on one side or the other, the more they stack, and the deeper that cleavage gets, until it becomes a Grand Canyon. And psychology research tells us the more stacked those cleavages, that one cleavage becomes, and the more groups stack, and there's only one division, the more hate there is, the more distrust, the more bias, all the bad psychological effects.
And isn't that what's happened?
That is exactly what's happened. What you want are cross-cutting cleavages in which you have 1,000 different divisions and they don't line up, and so it's kind of a mess. And so when you go to the ballot box and you vote, you're voting for one issue, right? You're concerned about some local issue about the school, that's what you're thinking about. And then you think about some issue for the state, you think about housing, and then you vote for a member of Congress, and then you vote for president. And which issues you're concerned with are different for each office, because it concerns a different geography, it concerns a different group of people, different powers. And none of those divisions, like there's divisions like we disagree on how to fix schools, and we disagree on how to fix housing, and we disagree on what to do with foreign policy, but none of those divisions line up with each other, right? They cross-cut one another. And so the stakes of the election go down. I know if I lose the presidency, that's fine, because I'm also very concerned with all these other issues that have nothing to do with that division. So we can compartmentalize all of these divisions and create low-stakes elections. Everyone with me?
Yep.
Okay. What's happened is that in the past generation, all of our divisions have been reduced down to one. And this is what political scientists call the nationalization of American politics. When American politics gets nationalized, you take, I feel like my face is in front of this. No, it's not gonna move, don't do that. You take a pluralistic, sectional, so you have groups focused on kind of sectional interests, local interests. That's very factional politics, so you have lots of different groups. That's how most American history has been governed. But the past generation has shifted to two national, sorted, meaning all the different like racial and religious and economic and educational, all of that gets sorted in one part or the other. It's polarized, so they don't agree on anything. And it's nationalized. And so you have two great big party, we call it blobs. And I'm going to talk about how most institutions in American life have become nationalized. Interest groups, state parties, the media, all these different institutions have become nationalized. And so more and more and more, everything's either this big Republican blob or this big Democratic blob. And so what Madison wanted most to avoid is happening right now, where the stakes get higher and higher. Why? Because all of our political divisions have been reduced down to this one division. So, nationalization, fancy definition, the homogenization of political agendas across subnational units, meaning state, local, interest groups, media, all these other units now are basically focused on the exact same issues as the presidential election. So this encourages you as voters to use the same criteria for every single box on the ballot. So I could show you data, we don't have time, but I could show you data showing how presidential elections are increasingly correlated with school superintendent elections, or how presidential elections explain and predict attorney general elections more than the crime rate. Everything has become nationalized. So we're no longer caring about local issues and state issues and things which are particular to your communities. All we're doing is having our hair on fire, running around freaking out over big national culture war questions, right? And so we don't even know what's going on in our communities. We don't know what problems face our states. We don't know what problems face our communities. And what is really important for you to take away from this, neither do elected politicians. Okay? Everyone with me? Questions?
They think they do.
Well, they think they do, yeah. Okay. I I think last time I talked to you, I talked about polarization. Most of you know what polarization is. That's why I'm not focusing on that today. What I want to emphasize is that we're talking about a trend which entrenches polarization and makes it worse. So I'm talking about a vicious cycle here. What this is charting nationalization and polarization. So let's focus on the gray triangles here. Okay, the gray triangles are DW nominate scores. This is the primary way in which political scientists measure polarization. You take every member of Congress, you record how they vote on every single bill, and then you can create a map on how much Republicans vote together and how much Democrats vote together. And you can go to voteview.com and you can look at this stuff yourself. It's fascinating. And so you can see that the trend is polarization is getting worse and worse and worse, right? Now, the black circles represent nationalization, or one easy measure of nationalization. And this is how correlated is the gubernatorial vote with the presidential vote. Now, if you're really thinking about state issues in a way that's separate from national issues, then you might split ticket vote. You might vote for governor for some other reason than the reason you're voting for president. Your criteria will be different, right? And so here we can see, like in the 60s, there was very little relationship between how you vote for governor and how you vote for the president. And it was, so for example, 40s you have low polarization, high nationalization. 60s you have low nationalization, low polarization. Very weird time in American life, the 1960s. I mean that not like it was bad. I mean that like the things like the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act would not have occurred in other eras. Okay? It's really hard to overcome a filibuster of 67 votes in the Senate without a political moment like this. Okay? Now we have high polarization and high nationalization, and they mutually reinforce each other. So, myriad institutions are nationalized, meaning every division, like at the state and local and county level, is effectively replicating the national division. And I bring this up because it's very important to see, and I'm going to talk about these examples of how these institutions have nationalized. That the previous period of polarization, the only analog to today, is the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. That's the previous point in which the parties were as polarized as they are today. The key difference, they were not nationalized in that period. And therefore, all these institutions that were not nationalized served to moderate the polarization of that time period. We don't have any moderating forces anymore. These same institutions, instead of moderating, exacerbate the polarization, makes it worse. That's what I'll try to show, okay? So, for example, these are vote view scores. These are polarization scores. This is 1890. I'm going to come back this year, important year for our time today. Ignore the up and down. That's complicated. We're not getting into that. Just left and right. You can see all the Democrats are voting the Democrats. All the Republicans are voting the Republicans. Very polarized system. Then this is 1979, okay, right before the Republicans take the Senate. And we have it's a wash. I mean, it's a mix. It's a very moderate time period, one of the most moderate time periods in American life. And here's today. Okay, so you can see how there's a kind of analog to the late 19th century in terms of polarization. The parties voting with the parties, not crossing lines, okay? Questions? Okay, I want to make sure you're all with me here. I run a very informal classroom, so don't even just yell. Now, let's start with the nationalization of state parties. I think the key thing that you can know that will help you unlock so much about American politics in the past 100 years is that the state level parties have fundamentally changed. They've become weak and they've become creatures of the national party. For most of American life, the national party didn't exist. It was just state parties. So you had a decentralized party system that moderated national polarization. You had, this is a famous line from Ike, there's not a Republican Party, there's 48 Republican parties. Okay, this is before Hawaii and Alaska. His point is, they all talk about different things. California Republicans and Virginia Republicans and Oklahoma Republicans, they're talking about different issues. there's a Republican and Democratic Party in basically every state. Another political scientist put it this way: we don't have a two-party system, we have a 100-party system. And so each party is focused on state issues more than national issues. Then every few years they get together at a convention, they hash out their differences, they figure out your state interests kind of align with my state interests, let's have a platform together. It's all very compromising, and what they especially do is they say, let's not talk about very divisive national questions. So, let's talk about the Federal Elections Bill of 1890. I chose this example because I really don't want you walking out of this room with a simplistic narrative of decline. We always have this tendency to think, it's so bad right now, it was so much better back then. Probably not. What I'm describing to you are a set of problems Americans have never faced before. That doesn't mean there weren't problems before. There were different kinds of problems. And I leave to you the judgment as to which set of problems you would prefer. There is no golden age. There's never been a time in which it's worked well. It's always been kind of a mess. It's about which kinds of problems we're facing. So I'm trying to describe a new set of problems. I would still rather be alive now than in 1890. The Federal Elections Bill was the last gasp of Reconstruction. Republicans desperately wanted to protect the rights of black men in the South to vote for self-serving election reasons. This is the time in which Jim Crow is really starting to get it's starting to get going. The KKK is lynching people left and right. The Southern, they're called bourbon Democrats, basically rich white Democrats in the South, had taken control of state legislatures and started to systematically exclude black men and poor white men, anyone who might vote Republican. And so the South is starting to become a one-party authoritarian state. And Republicans in Congress are saying, let's try to get this elections bill through, which would allow federal officers to go south, register black men to vote, stay at the polling stations, if need be through force, protect their right to vote. So Republicans passed this bill through the House, it fails in the Senate. Why? Because Western Republicans were sent to Congress not to care about national questions, they were sent to Congress to care about state issues, and what they really cared about was changing to the silver standard, because their states had a lot of silver mining and farmers, and changing to bimetallism from the gold standard would have been inflationary and would have helped the farmers pay off their debts. And so Western Republicans bolted from the party, and the federal elections bill never happened. Notice, you should have mixed feelings about this. Nationalization is bad. This also is bad. There isn't a perfect system. I'm just talking about a new set of problems, but the decentralized also have lots of problems. If you want to explain, for example, why polarization was very limited in the 20th century, it's primarily because the Democratic Party didn't really have to compete for a majority in the House or the Senate, because 1/4 of the seats of Congress were from the South, and Republicans never had a shot at the South because it was an authoritarian one-party state for most of the 20th century. So if you want to talk about there's lots of good things, oh, it was so great in the 1950s, we all got along. Well, there was a reason why we all got along, and it's not a pretty reason. So there's all kinds of problems today, there was all kinds of problems yesterday. I'm just trying to describe how these problems are new and how we haven't experienced them before, okay? Today, the state parties are not different from state to state. I think the best analogy of this is from a political scientist named Hopkins. He gives this example. If you go to Nevada and you go to McDonald's, do you expect it to taste like a California McDonald's?
Yes.
Every state you go to in the Union, you'll see a McDonald's and a Burger King, and they'll offer the exact same things on their menu, right? You can be a McDonald's person or a Burger King person, no matter where you are in the nation, it's the same choice. That's what state parties have become today. The California Republican Party is effectively the same as the Oklahoma Republican Party and the Wisconsin Republican Party, and the same for Democrats. They're each tiny little replicas of the national parties. They're not concerned with state level issues as much as they used to be. That's what we're talking about when we mean nationalized. No one cares as much anymore about state issues And therefore, there aren't as many cross-cutting cleavages when the parties get together to hash out their compromises. They don't have to compromise, really. It's a bunch of activists gathering together, all caring about the same culture war national questions. Now, there's a couple ways you can measure this. One easy way is just to read party platforms for the past 100 years. So you can gather all the party platforms from all the state parties for the last decades, and you can look at how they've changed. I'm not going to get into the exact measurement here. I just want to point out, Republicans, since the 90s, you can look at Republican state platforms. They get really, really identical. Republicans in Oklahoma are talking about the exact same things as Republicans from California, which is not what you'd expect in the 19th century. So they're not concerned about Oklahoman issues. They're concerned about national questions. Democrats were a little bit different, but now they're just like Republicans. Democratic state party platforms, it's like McDonald's. It's all the same. I'll get a Big Mac here. I'll get a Big Mac in North Dakota. It's the same. This is another measure. If, for example, you were trying to predict what is in a party platform, what issues are being discussed in a party platform, I said you can pick a year or you can pick the state. Like, what's more predictive of what's going to be in the platform? For most of American life, the state is much more predictive. And that's because a party platform through time in the same state is going to be talking about the same issues year after year after year. But recently, the year of the platform is more predictive in what's being talked about in the platform than which state it's from. Why? Because the Republicans in this state and the Republicans in this state are no longer talking about state issues. They're talking about the same issues. Now, they're talking about different issues from year to year because there's a new freak out national issue every other election. Right? So they're kind of tracking like, ooh, let's talk about this thing. Ooh, let's talk about this thing. Ooh, let's talk about this thing. So there's no consistency, but more importantly, there's no specialization. There's no attention to the needs of Californians versus the needs of Wisconsinites, right? So it's nationalized. I'll just point out, if you look at which kinds of issues have been trending up, it's the big culture war issues. Abortion, gender, gay marriage, those kinds of things. Things that are really divisive, that get people really riled up, that don't really have anything to do with state interests. Things like agriculture, no one cares. Even though it really affects a lot of people's lives in many states. And by the way, the agricultural issues in Wisconsin don't match onto the agricultural issues in California. So, state parties. The fact that the state parties are dead has also completely changed presidential nominations. Until 1968, when the Democrats couldn't get their act together and failed miserably in Chicago at a convention, we had a national nominating convention, a very normal process by which state and party leaders from the states chose delegates. Those delegates went to a national convention and they chose a nominee and a platform through various compromises and backroom dealing. And what they were doing was aggregating sectional interests. Historically, this was a very good system. You got a lot of kind of boring old dad candidates, right? No one hates them, no one really loves them, but they're competent. They unite the party. They tend to be good leaders. You have mainstream candidates. They're somewhat pleasing to a majoritarian coalition. Not a big majority that's natural, a majority that has to be kind of cobbled together through backroom dealing because you have 1,000 factions, not just 2. So this quote I think is particularly instructive. This is Lincoln in 1860s writing a letter. How am I going to win this nomination for the Republican Party? He says, this is what I'm going to do. My name is new in the field, and I suppose I'm not the first choice of a very great many, which is true. Our policy then is to give no offense to others. This does not sound familiar to me. Leave them in a mood to come to us if they shall be compelled to give up their first love. This too is dealing justly with all, and leaving us in a mood to support heartily whoever shall be nominated. What's the strategy? Be everyone's second choice. The current vice president called the current president a racist in the last Democratic primary. You don't get that here. You don't have these massive divisions that then we all have to get along together, right? I want to be nice to everyone. I want everyone to like me. Let's all find things that we get along with. It's much easier to find party unity. Now we have primary elections, and I can get into why we have primary elections later. But how it works now is, of course, delegates are chosen through a popular vote process. What this means is the national party becomes strong because the national party creates rules for the state parties to follow. So the state parties wither and die because they no longer have independent power over the nominees and over the party. So those sectional interests and sectional views, they don't have any power anymore. It's all about the national party now. But also, the national party, while it has strong power over the states, or the state parties, they don't really have any power over their candidates. One of the major reasons why there's no third parties in America is because it's super easy to take over a party from the inside. Neither candidate for president today would ever be selected in the convention system, not a chance. Donald Trump was hated by every Republican elite in 2016, but he took over the party from the inside because of the primary election. Now, depending on your view, that might be a great thing. I'm just pointing out it just wouldn't have happened in the convention system. Kamala Harris would never have been selected using the convention system. A primary election, particularly a primary election that has this ridiculous system of let's have 4 months of voting where this state votes here and then what it does is it tends to favor candidates with very fervent factional support, because you don't need to win every election. You just need to get high enough to get enough money from donors to get to the next state and the next state and the next state. And so what you don't want to be everyone's second favorite. If you're everyone's second favorite, you're going to lose. You need to be some people's savior. And so you want to enliven the passions of a small faction, get them to the polls, get just enough so you get to the next place and just survive. It's a very bad system of creating consensus and of finding candidates who can kind of get a majoritarian consensus. What this tends to favor, because it tends to favor more kind of ideological candidates, it also means the general election, the stakes go up. Because now it's not just a bunch of boring old dads fighting, it's people that you might really disagree with and genuinely fear. And so now there's this kind of sense that, oh, we really have to win or America's doomed. Everyone with me? By the way, let me list for you the democracies. Here are the democracies that use the popular vote system to select nominees to the highest office of its land. Okay? You've got the United States, end of list. We are the only democracy in the world that uses this kind of system. Now, usually, if you told me we're the only democracy in the world that does, I would say, well, that's because we're the best. It must be a good thing. I'm not convinced that this is a good thing. So state parties wither. Presidential nominations become a mess. Candidates, the party can't control the candidates, the party can't control its brand, the party can't control its messaging. It's much, much harder for parties to kind of maintain, this is what our focus is going to be, these are the issues we're going to talk about. It just gets harder. And it's harder to select candidates that might be pleasing to a majority of Americans.
I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
You said popular vote, but I thought ours was the electoral college. You can lose the popular vote and still win.
I'm talking specifically about the nomination process.
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
I'm not going to talk about the electoral college at all.
Because you have no thoughts about it?
Just empty head, nothing going on. Other questions?
The other thing about the nominations is each party tries to go to the extremes to get the nomination, and then after they get the nomination, they try and get back to the center.
Yes.
Which makes it a very confusing messaging.
Yeah.
strategy.
I'll mention this later, but the parties are increasingly becoming coalitions of interest groups and activists who have views that are wildly out of step with the median voter. And so, because primary elections tend to favor those who are really passionate about politics, and by the way, if you're really passionate about politics, you need to really understand you're a weird person. It's okay, you're still loved, but you're different. And so the primary elections tend to have that going to the polls. And then in the general election, you know, they all pretend like they've been moderate the whole time. Yeah, it's a mess. Whereas the convention, you select a message, you select candidates, it's kind of in the news, but then you come out with a united front. And they always understand that we actually have to pick moderate candidates if we want to get the votes. The first candidate chosen in a primary election, George McGovern in '72, he won one state in the general election. So right away it was like, maybe this doesn't work that well at picking candidates generally pleasing to Americans. So notice, I'm not blaming politicians, I'm not even blaming parties. You have to think about what are the rules by which we create consensus. And it's especially important in the American experience because the American experience, as Madison noted, was all about creating diversity. And so if you have radical diversity, now you need complicated mechanisms to bring everyone back together. And there's no obvious answer to that. It's really hard to do. Okay, we did the state parties, we did nominations. Talk about interest groups. Interest groups used to seek access. That's why they gave money to everyone. And so it was on a bipartisan basis. I want to give you money for your campaign, so when I call you, you pick up the phone. Today, interest groups are increasingly just partisan actors. They pick a side and they fully join that side. You no longer have single issue groups, really. Single issue groups, and there's good research on this, the more aligned you become with a party, and they feel like they have to fully align with the party because of the polarization. No one could work together in Congress, so I guess I have to pick a side. The more aligned you get with a party, the party pressures you to put out more and more public statements about every other issue under the sun aligned with the party. And so each interest group becomes a replica of the national party. Notice how this, again, raises the stakes of the election. It used to be you say, well, I really care about this issue, and the parties aren't talking about it, but that's fine because I still have access to Washington through this interest group, right? I can organize, I'll donate, whatever. Now, there isn't a game in town that's not the Democrats or the Republicans. Everything gets slotted into these two-party blobs. So, for example, well, I'm going to skip this for the sake of time. I'll just note, these are all kind of single-issue interest groups, and they're all either fully with the Democrats or fully with the Republicans. And this is the effect of polarization. And so you have this institution in American life nationalized because of the polarization and the kind of pull. Native American tribes is the only one that I can see that's kind of roughly bipartisan.
Question on that one. So foreign policy is in blue. That's an anomaly, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know what specific interest groups they're grouping under foreign policy. They do have, I don't think it's captured here. Israel also is, yeah. So for example, I know these aren't interest groups really, but I think this is illustrative of what's going on with interest groups. We've seen these ridiculous yard signs, right? Sorry, I shouldn't express my views so strongly. You always see yard signs expressing beliefs that are shared by all their neighbors. You see this, okay, so look at this. Climate justice and racial justice. This is a new thing that these are like two sides of the same coin or something. This is the kind of where you see a listing of this kind of stuff. These things don't really have anything to do with each other. I don't think climate change has much of anything to do with racial justice. I mean, I've heard the arguments, you can make connections, but they don't have intimate connections here. What's going on? These are the interest groups and activists within our coalition. And so I feel pressure to make them fit together, and I'm going to list them all and say these are all kind of facets of a diamond. And that's what interest groups are increasingly pressured to do. Okay.
You mean that sign doesn't tell you what side you're on? Is that what you're telling me?
No, my point is this side does tell you, or this side does tell you what side you're on. But this is a list of things. This is a list of things that they don't really have anything to do with each other. These should be individual interest groups.
They're one side.
But they're one side for a reason. They're not one side because of logic. They're not one side because of philosophy. They're one side because of the political environment of the United States. And so all these different groups kind of get joined up with all the other ones because they feel like I gotta be with the Democrats to get my issue to win. But to be with the Democrats means I gotta also have to adopt all these other issues because I have to join the other interest groups that have also joined with the Democrats.
Right.
Well, and I also think part of the polarization is reflected in that sign, because I would argue that some of those things really should have nothing to do with party politics. As Christians, be kind, love is love, you know, really, I mean, really? You know, so
No, but
then-
Republicans are all mean.
Yeah, well, that's what I, see, that's part of the polarization,
Yes.
right? Is if you align yourself with love, then what does that say about everybody else?
And I'm glad you're picking up on this. This is one of the effects of a nationalized politics.
Right?
If we're talking about, you know, I'm worried about the farmers in Modesto.
Mhm.
I mean, is that really gonna make you, I'm gonna go vote and I'm gonna feel like I'm on the side of the angels? If you're talking about state and local interests and kind of sectional interests, it's a really kind of a boring, practical politics in which you can compromise, in which you can work with other people. You get a bridge, I get a bridge, right?
You get things done.
But here, a nationalized politics emphasizes identity.
Yeah.
So it always encourages you to feel like I'm on the side of the angels. My tribe is the righteous one, right? And so it becomes a moralized politics. Most policy questions are actually just practical questions,
Right.
but we moralize them. I mean, I'll get in trouble for this. Even the question of abortion is fundamentally a practical question. How do we get abortions lower? I don't know. That's a practical question. But we take every single issue and we moralize it and say, nope, it's black and white. And if you're on the wrong side, you're part of the devil. And so this is the effect of a nationalized politics, because what do all of us Americans have in common? Well, we all have different schools, we all have different economies. What do we have in common? Let's divide over big culture war issues. That's a national politics. And so it gets ugly, and it feels like it's high stakes, and it feels like everything's gonna come crumbling down around me if I lose. All right. I want to, for example, let's look at how this has changed political parties. This is the most famous definition of party. This is from Anthony Downs, 1957. A political party is a team of men seeking, you can see the time. No one would say that today, you get fired. Team of men seeking to control the governing apparatus by gaining office in a duly constituted election. Notice the emphasis is on politicians and the emphasis on how to get elections won. Now, this is a new party definition. This is not universally accepted, but most political scientists are using this definition now as a kind of better understanding. Coalitions of interest groups and activists seeking to capture and use government for their particular goals. Notice the emphasis is not on winning elections. It's jamming my policies through and then freaking out about how can we win elections. The politicians who just want to win elections, they'll be moderate, they'll compromise. But if it's an activist class who's wildly out of step with the Americans, with the median voter on most issues, you're going to get a politics in which you're faced with two choices. This freaks me out slightly less, so I'll vote for this. Okay, a couple more things. I know I'm going long. Let's look at the Senate and the House. You think, aren't those national offices? Let's look at what incentivizes the Senate and the House. Here's charting how much money is being contributing to senators from out of state. So if you're a senator and you're running for re-election, you need a lot of money. You're going to take some money from people you're representing. That makes sense. But they're taking more and more money from people out of state. So for a while, the Republicans were taking most of their money from people that were in their own states, which is what you would kind of want. Now, both Democrats and Republicans, 2/3 or more of their campaign donations are coming from donors that they are not representing. Now, when it comes to money in politics, you can't really make strong causal claims. It's really difficult to determine whether money is the cause or the effect. Is this senator voting this way because he got paid, or is this senator voting this way and therefore he got paid? It's hard to tease it out, and this is a perennial problem in political science. And I see journalists all the time making very strong claims that they don't have empirical evidence for. It's really hard to tease it out. I just want to point out, if this is changing behavior in any way, we have a serious legitimacy crisis in the Senate. The whole purpose of the Senate is to protect the interests of states. But if senators are responding to the views of the zip code, the ATM zip codes, as we call them, because most political donations come from a number of zip codes of very wealthy white people. If they're responding to those issues, why do we even have this Senate? I mean, this is the most malapportioned legislature in the world. The reason we have it is to protect state interests. If they're not protecting state interests, why are we having it? So it's a big problem. Here's the House. More and more money is coming from out of the district. So only like a quarter of the money being donated is coming from people you represent. And so whose interests are you going to be responding to? Here's some evidence that you're not actually responding to the interests of your constituents. So let's take all the votes of a member of Congress, how they vote on every kind of bill. Then let's take survey information, and we can create a kind of picture of what the median voter in the district wants on all these same issues. And then let's take Federal Election Commission data on everyone who's donated to campaign this year, and then we can look, what does the median donor want on all these same issues? And then we can compare, who is the member of Congress responding to? Are they lining up with their district, or are they lining up with the donor class?
Donor.
You'll be, no, you're not surprised. Okay. If the donor disagrees with the median voter in the district, the member of Congress goes with the donor 81% of the time. If the donor disagrees with the district, the median voter in the district, and the median partisan voter. So if you're a Democratic congressman, you don't really care what Republicans in your district think, right? You care about what the Democrats in your district think. The median Democrat, you still don't go with the median Democrat. 60% of the time, 2/3 of the time, you still go with the donors. And so the opinions being represented in Congress, in the House and the Senate, are increasingly detached from local communities. They're increasingly detached from state interests and what you're worried about and what affects your neighborhood. This is a very nationalized, elite, partisan battle that has increasingly little to do with this town.
How do you combat that? Yeah, let's fix it.
Yes.
I've been thinking that the American idea of a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-everything, how can you make all these different groups one and the same thing? It's the important thing.
You do so by ignoring most of them. You do so by artificially narrowing the political agenda to just a few things. I don't have the data on me, but I could show you all kinds of data. There's all kinds of issues not being discussed. Politicians will discuss only those issues that help them win elections. And so if there's things we agree on, you're never going to hear about it. If there's the things that only affect Sacramento, you're never going to hear about it.
But is there any chance that we could have just government pay for elections and not have people donate as much money as they want? That seems to me the crux of the problem. I mean, these rich people get to call the shots.
Well, I think you run into lots of First Amendment problems. And I think money is the first step, but it's not going to solve everything. You need to, what's most difficult, okay, every political science book you read is going to have a final chapter, like, what do we do now? And there's some hope and no optimism. It's like, this might work, but no one's confident. And that's because all these things I'm describing to you are mutually reinforcing. One of the major things that really would help is if one party won huge majorities in an election and crushed the other party, forcing the other party to change what issues they're talking about. That's not happening. And it's not happening primarily because each party gets like 49% of the vote, and they're thinking, that's enough, we can kind of squeak by in the next election. They have no incentive to change. They also have very little capacity to change. The parties are organizationally pathetic. They're weak. They have no power over their candidates. They have no power over the message. So it's very difficult to craft a kind of moderate message that could appeal to like 55% of Americans. And so when the parties are weak, they become captured by activists who are very bad at winning elections. And so you're kind of stuck in this cycle.
Well, if you've got a whole sizable group of popular voters in the middle that don't like either party, that base does not have any power unless they can affect the electoral college. Popular vote at that level is not going to get very far. So there's really no incentive to create that third party.
Correct. So there's two major reasons why we don't have more than two parties. The first is what you've described. We would call it Duverger's law. It has to do with how you create your elections. So if you have a first past the post system in which 50% plus one gets all the power, you create an incentive that it's too much work to create third parties because you're going to lose and you won't get any power. The second reason is that the parties are porous. So I don't know why you would start a third party. Donald Trump laid out the groundwork, take it over from the inside. Bernie Sanders took it over from the inside and largely changed the party. Bernie Sanders pretended to be an independent for many years. And then he decided to stop pretending and just run as a Democrat, and he changed the Democratic Party. You don't have any power if you're trying to go outside of the system. Okay, one final point, the news media. You all know about this. This is the rate of newspapers being sold, okay? And now it just took a plummet right around the time Al Gore created the internet. So, all of us are concerned, I think, about the polarization of media, and I think we should be concerned, but that's kind of the American norm. What's new is the nationalization of media. So in American history, you'd have hundreds of papers, all of them overtly partisan, but each paper had a little geographic niche, right? That doesn't really exist anymore. Most of you aren't getting your primary news from the Sacramento Bee. So each newspaper that still exists to get more readership is just going national. So for example, you can look at 200 papers over the past 20 years, and computers can do this analysis. What issues are they talking about over time? Not local issues. That goes down. The president was going down until Donald Trump. He had a big effect there. Everyone wants to read about Donald Trump. Sports, most important thing in life. Congress, right? This is the nationalization of the media institution. So you're not being informed about local issues anymore. You're not encouraged to care about local issues, but even if you care about local issues, it gets much harder to find out about local issues. TV, local TV is actually stuck around, it's doing okay still, but it doesn't have the same effect. So here we're comparing what is the effect of reading the newspaper on how much you know who the mayor is, and how much you know who the school superintendent is, and how much you participate in local kind of political things. TV has very limited effect at increasing in any of these things. In fact, hurts you from knowing who the school superintendent is. That's probably not big enough to be significant. But you see that newspapers actually matter here. Local newspapers with actual journalists doing the hard work of showing what's going on in local politics, what's going on in your community, what are the issues that are facing your neighborhood. We don't know about them anymore. No. Politicians stopped caring about them, and we don't know about them. So, I want to end with some good news, and then thinking about what can we do. So first, I'm not your pastor, but I found it very helpful to meditate for a good chunk of time on things that are not at stake. I'll just mention two things here. First, what's not at stake is God's mission. And I find it very helpful to think about, doesn't matter who wins the next election, love will ultimately win. And not the cheap love wins kind of love, but the terrifying, perfecting love of God will win, no matter what. It can't be affected. Beauty will win, light will win, all that's wrong will be made right. And it doesn't matter what a few piddly Americans think about elections, God's plans will not be stopped. I like that thought. I find that comforting. I also find it comforting to think that my job as a Christian largely won't change. There's going to be an angry man driving a lifted Chevy with a flag that says F Joe Biden driving down the road. He needs love more than anything else in the world. And who has God appointed to love him? Unfortunately, us. Because if we don't, who will? And the purple-haired lady blocking traffic on the Bay Bridge, so you're late to work. She needs love. And who has God appointed to love her? Us. Because if who doesn't, who will? If we don't, who will? And this mission it's like a law of gravity. It's in the firmament of reality. It doesn't matter what happens in the election. It doesn't matter how high the stakes get, right? It's not as if you are commanded to love, unless that, Democrat wins. Commanded to love no matter what. And so I can wake up in the morning and I know my mission is unchanged. It doesn't matter what happens. I can wake up the morning after the election and know I still have the same mission of loving people in my community. And so there's this stability here, this constant. And I want to mention in particular, what I've been describing to you is particularly of interest to the local church. I can't think of any institution in American life that emphasizes local communities and physical gatherings like the local church. We're here together. We're not on Zoom. Well, I don't, but we all live in close proximity to one another, right? We're in the same neighborhoods, the same zip codes. We all face the same issues. There's a vacuum of caring in your local communities. No one's going to fill it, but the local church can fill that. And I feel very strongly that Christians are being called right now to deeply care more and more about their local communities and to be distinctive in that. I don't think you worrying about the presidential election is making a contribution to the country. Everyone else is doing it already. They don't need your help. The distinctive contribution Christians can make is loving their neighbor, their physical neighbor who has needs and problems that the politicians have no clue about. Focusing on local issues, school issues, housing issues, homelessness issues, things that are affecting Sacramento. That's where you can make a distinctive contribution. Because the more and more the church and you get sucked into the partisan vortex, the more redundant you become. You're not making any distinctive contribution if you fall prey to this nationalized politics. Everyone's already doing it. What can we do that's different, that's distinctive? We're already here, we live here, we gather together. Do you know how incredible it is that there's Republicans and Democrats in this room and you love each other? I'm serious. It's incredible. No other institution in American life is deeply embedded in local communities and can care and can bring meals to people and can help with schools and can do all the things that this church does. I'm not telling you to change what you're doing. I mean, you had the misfortune of having me as your deacon for years. So I've been in the meetings. I've heard the conversations. I know the heart of this church. So I'm just trying to affirm and encourage and embolden. But no one cares about your local community anymore, but this church can. There's this vacuum that can be filled. One final point. It can be filled particularly if we personally don't fall prey to the vortex of national partisanship. And here I'm going to talk about your identity. You should vote, and you should care, and you can vote with one party for election after election. That's fine. That's not what I'm talking about. How do you feel in political space? Do you feel like you're strongly attached to a party? Do you kind of have a kind of emotional attachment to a party? Because if you do, I would warn you, you're in dangerous grounds. Because there's basically no upsides to having a strong partisan identity. And there's a long list of downsides, psychologically. So, I have some homework. Many of you aren't going to want to do this. I really encourage you to try this out. How many of you have attended a political party meeting in the past month or so? Do you go to these annual meetings of the Republican or Democratic parties? How many of you pay a membership fee? How many of you have a kind of member card with your picture on it? No? How many of you go to Costco? Do you go to Costco like me and you think, we're the real Americans? We're not like those communists at Walmart. We're saving this country. One hot dog at a time. You're more a member of Costco than you are a Republican or a Democrat. You are a Republican or a Democrat. It's just in your head. That's where it exists. It has no material reality to it. You're not a member. In American politics, you're a voter. You're not a member. And in California, your party affiliation doesn't matter. Your ballot is exactly the same. Except in the primary. In which you can pick and choose, like I do, which party you want to vote for. I've changed my party affiliation so much. I want to encourage you, don't do it now because it might mess with your ballot. Wait till after the election. Day after the election, go to this website. You can do this in 2 minutes. I do it all the time, it's fun. Okay? Change your party affiliation. Because it doesn't matter, but change it. Now, change it for a day or two. I would encourage you to change it through the midterms. Because I want you to see and feel that it doesn't matter. If you're a Republican, become a Democrat. If you're a Democrat, become a Republican. If you're registered no party preference and you think of yourself as, oh, I'm above the fray. Stop lying, admit that you vote with one party over the other consistently, and register vote with the party you don't like.
Ouch.
And then wait to see. Maybe nothing will happen. Maybe nothing will happen. But I bet something might happen in your hearts when you read the news, when you talk to people who are of this party now you're a newest member of. I just want you to feel that your party membership doesn't exist. It's fake. It's not real. It has no attachment to you, right? It shouldn't have any kind of hold on your identity. You're just a voter. And the more emotionally attached you get to a party, the easier you're making the politicians to get your vote. Because emotional attachments cover over a multitude of sins. Make them woo you. Play a little hard to get. But more importantly, I hope that maybe you'll look at people differently. Because you'll feel like, yeah, I guess I'm not attached to that party anymore. I have no attachment to that party of any kind. Every few years I vote, and it just so happens I might vote with the same party, but that's not me. That's not part of my identity. I don't know. Try it out. See how it makes you feel.
Should stop the slide.
Yes.
So I do change for the primary because it makes a difference. I just think that when you're talking about local politics, there is no party, right?
Mhm.
If you go down to like the city council meeting, there's no party involved in that. It's like people from different neighborhoods are getting up and they're speaking for their neighborhood.
Mhm.
And so it's the only place you have any control. I mean, it's like, I've just felt like I went to a neighborhood event for the city that I live in last night. And it was so much fun to talk to people who felt differently about an issue, but we were there in the same room talking to each other. But it was just a little issue, like, where are you gonna put the new dog park? That's really what it was, right? But it was so much fun to talk about people about why they believe something different. And I thought, this is something where it actually can count, is to just go and talk about the new dog, where you want the new dog park to go. But I thought, that's the only place I can have any control.
And you, for that space of time, you weren't thinking about who's going to be president.
No, I didn't care. I quit listening to anything about who's gonna be.
Yeah. I've actually told my.
I actually mute it on the TV.
I've actually told my students to stop reading the news. You used to put in your syllabus like you should be reading newspapers. Now I'm like, you could skip it. No, I think that's an excellent example because you're not talking about Republican dog parks and Democratic dog parks.
No, I'm just talking about the.
And if you had known the partisan identity of the person you're talking to, all of a sudden all kinds of malfunctions go on in the brain. You're like, I got to come up with reasons why this is a terrible idea, right?
Yeah.
And so these local issues, they're not usually partisan, and that's why it creates a cross-cutting cleavage, right? Everything gets moderated, your psychology changes, everything gets put into perspective. Yeah.
I just had a quick question. So I grew up in the era of Billy Graham, and Billy Graham stayed out of politics. But Franklin Graham, boy, he is all in on Trump. And I find it so divisive with some of the, and I'm a registered Republican, I'm just saying, I don't feel it helpful for someone who's an evangelist to just come out and support and kind of vilify the, I mean, to me, that's so divisive, it's not unifying. And I'm glad our church, you know, we're not getting from a pastor, this is the way you should vote, and that type of thing.
I mean, you should see his text messages. No, I agree with you. I agree. It's extremely, extremely toxic. And I guess I'm not an expert in the politicization of evangelicalism, so I'm not going to make any strong claims. But I agree with you. It's very concerning and toxic, particularly for the church, which the church is perfectly placed for American politics if we take the opportunity, because there is no other identity available to human beings that is as cosmopolitan as the Christian identity. It attaches you to all tribes. There's no other identity that can even come close to Christianity that can do that. And so we of all people should be the most kind of bipartisan. And kind of objectively we are, right? You just don't know about it. And you don't feel it. Because you don't see that in the news, you don't hear that from people like Franklin Graham. Yeah.
Are you starting to lecture or go into the foreign influence that is coming in via AI and that sort of thing?
No, I don't know the research on that or the effects of that. No, I haven't read studies on that. I share your concern, but no, I don't know enough to say.
Could you repeat the question? I didn't figure.
The concern is about the increasing foreign influence in elections, especially with AI and false information and things like that. I do teach on free speech, and I'm looking forward to the mess produced from AI.
Yes.
Yeah.
Going back to 1968, what are the chances of us going back to that better system for nominating candidates versus, or is that genie out of the bottle?
Why did they change?
Well, okay, so there already were some primaries in place. So we get primaries starting with the progressive era, early 20th century. And there's a good reason for that, because the parties were phenomenally corrupt. And so there is an effort to take power away from the machines. And so you think about the major urban cities in the 19th and early 20th centuries, there's not a social safety net. The local government really is the party boss. If you are running out of food, you talk to the party worker, and then you're expected to show up to vote for the party. It's all very corrupt. So it was an effort to fix that corruption, the primary elections. And so we started doing primary elections for state offices and congressional offices and that thing. And in the first half of the 20th century, there were some presidential primaries. So Kennedy famously fought his way to win the West Virginia primary. And so you just didn't have to contest any primary to win. So in 1968, you had, I'm going to get this wrong, Hubert Humphrey, who was LBJ's handpicked successor, and he really wanted to, he never ran in any primary. People like RFK had run in a few primaries and gotten very, very popular. And so you could still win all the delegates you needed without running in any primary. 1968 was basically Vietnam, divided the Democrats so severely, and also the mayor of Chicago encouraged the police to violently break up a rally, and it was all televised. And so it's delegitimizing to the entire process. The reason why we have conventions is because the 1820s system and the 18-teen system, called the King Caucus, faced a crisis in which it was no longer viewed as legitimate, so you had to change. That's what happened in 1968. And so the Democrats had the McGovern-Fraser Commission, which suggested all kinds of changes, including primary elections, quotas for women and racial minorities and all these kinds of things. And it required state parties to fall in line. State parties then had to change state laws And so Republicans also adopted primaries. I don't see how you go back to a convention system because voters tend not to want to give up their own power.
Sure.
So you could do things like have all primary elections on one day. You could kind of fiddle with the system. I don't see how we go back to the convention. Primaries weren't really a problem because you had what was called the invisible primary. The invisible primary describes a phenomenon where elites behind the scenes before the first day of voting had already effectively agreed on who they were going to support. And so before any vote was cast, you had one candidate who got all the endorsements and most of the money. So, you know, George Bush, before any vote was cast, he was going to be the candidate. That by Obama, that's dead. It has a lot to do with early polling and media attention and the never-ending campaigns. And so it's just a lot harder for elites to organize and form coalitions. And most political scientists would say the elites don't have enough power, and that doesn't play well with most voters.
When Biden dropped out and there was a lot of talk about it would have been better for the Democratic Party to have allowed, and I think it was the convention, there was some talk about allowing it to go to the convention. And it seems to me when I was growing up as, you know, a youngster, junior high school, that it was that the conventions were times when there were a lot of rallies for different candidates. It was very exciting to kind of watch that on television, to see how different states were kind of trying to form like coalitions to nominate. That was very exciting. It's kind of boring to watch a convention.
Yeah, it's a bunch of people who hate each other pretending to love each other.
It's just a lot of this, but there's never any sense that there's something actually, that any kind of power is being moved around or anything. So was that talk about not endorsing or not sort of making Harris the de facto nominee, but doing it all in a convention, was that sort of a throwback idea? Because of the primaries, how could they do that?
The biggest problem was no one in the Democratic Party is alive who remembers how to run an open convention.
Oh,
They don't know how to do it.
well, I believe
So-
that, I was a kid.
They had, you take someone like Josh Shapiro, with a bunch of people, a bunch of governors who think, you know, they'd be pretty good nominees. But from their perspective, it's pretty risky to force a contested convention. It would hurt the party and would hurt their future candidacies.
Yeah.
So it's probably better for me just to shut up, endorse Kamala, hope she loses, and I'll run in 2028. And that's probably what most Democratic would-be candidates did. So Kamala is the nominee, not because the party's strong, precisely because the party's weak. And they had no mechanisms or procedures by which to pick a different. And so this was the kind of easiest road to take.
Isn't it a time crunch too, as they waited till the convention?
Significant time crunch.
End of October, end of July.
And big questions
no
as
time
to
do
ballot
it.
deadlines, you have to get names on ballots, it's a
It
big
would
mess.
not have worked.
Yeah,
It was a mess.
yeah.
You do a lot of your work is data driven, and the polling data's changed radically over the last several decades, particularly with anybody under 35 who doesn't get a newspaper, know what it is, or watch too much TV. How reliable is your polling data for predicting
Data.
winners and losers?
Well, I want to be very clear, none of this is my work. I'm a teacher primarily. My work is in 18th century philosophy. So I don't do much data work. And I think from reading pollsters that I trust and different data people, even political scientists as well, the short answer is no one has any idea. There's so much uncertainty. And political scientists are usually pretty bad to talk to about the upcoming election because our usual answer is we don't know enough yet. And pollsters and journalists are incentivized to make strong claims, but frankly, we don't know.
That's true.
Okay.
Thank you, Joel.